So, justice is a pillar of our democracy, but just how solid is that pillar? And where is reform most needed? I'm joined by three guests for an extended discussion on justice in Canada. With me in our studios is Carissima Mathen. She is the Vice Dean Academic and Associate Professor of Law at the University of Ottawa. She's an expert in constitutional and criminal law. From Toronto, we're joined by Denise Balkissoon, a columnist with the Globe and Mail and co-founder of The Ethnic Isle, a blog about race and ethnicity in Toronto. And Promise Holmes Skinner is an Indigenous lawyer, the senior manager with Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto. She's also an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. First of all, welcome to all of you. Thanks for taking the time to talk about this important subject. And if I can, Denise Balkissoon, I'd like to start with you. Let me begin by having you describe for us how you see the justice system in Canada today.
I don't have very much positive to say, unfortunately. Last week, the Globe won a bunch of online journalism awards for a project that we did this year. I didn't have very much to do with it, but it was called Unfounded, and it was about how mostly women who make sexual assault complaints in police jurisdictions across Canada are usually or very often ignored or dismissed. Their cases sort of left to languish. So, from a journalist point of view, maybe all I'm seeing are the stories that don't have happy endings, but it's not something that I look at with much, I don't really know what the word is, confidence, I guess, on a daily basis.
Okay, that's an opening comment from you. Carissima Mathen here in the studio. How do you view the justice system in Canada?
It's a work in progress. It's aspirational. So certainly as someone who teaches criminal law and teaches it over the course of, jurisprudence going back hundreds of years, you can see the evolution. You can see how it has moved to being more respectful of equality and the balance between the state, the enormous resources that the state brings to bear, and the defendant, the accused person. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it's an incredibly powerful tool of coercion and control. And it can be used for ill ends, and it is also inescapably political, and so that also brings with it lots of challenges.
All right, we'll get into some of those in the time we have to discuss this. Promise Holmes Skinner, a justice system in Canada. When I say those words, what thoughts does it evoke for you?
I agree that it's certainly come a long way, but it's definitely failing. It's failing a lot of folks, individuals from marginalized communities, in particular individuals with mental health issues, and especially Aboriginal people in Canada have been failed by the justice system since it began. And we can see that with the legacy of residential schools when you had our CMP going in and taking children away and putting them in places where they were physically and psychologically tortured. And then now you have, you see that legacy through various ways, but one way is the over-incarceration of Indigenous people at alarming rates, and arrests and jail sentences are being handed down to the very victims of the Canadian justice system's torture. And so the fact that we're still dealing with this, and I imagine we'll be dealing with it for a very long time, tells me that the system, unfortunately, is failing.
We like to hear in this country that we have a justice system that's often the envy of the world, and that it has as its hallmark impartiality. And Carissima, let me start with you. How accurate is that statement today? And if it's not accurate, how come it's not accurate?
It depends what you're talking about. So I think, first of all, it's important to note that, lots of criminal cases never even get to trial, so they're resolved by pleas between a very well-resourced Crown and a defendant who is often not. Mm-hmm. So I think once you actually get to that formality of the trial process, I think our principles are very strong, and there's active and conscious attempt to abide by those principles, but there's lots of decisions in the justice system that get made shielded from view, decisions by police, decisions by prosecutors that are protected, that really can't be investigated, and that allows room for discriminatory application of the law, and that's a huge problem.
Denise Balkissoon, what are your thoughts on that? And how do we open that up? How do we get at that problem in the system if that's one of the things that needs reform?
Impartiality, what would I say? I would say that probably, if Carissima is saying that by the time things make it to trial, that it is more impartial. That again gets back to my point, which is what do we do when complaints are first made if we're talking about criminal justice? I would also say that at the highest level, so if we're talking about trial, we're talking about judges, my guess, although I don't know, is that the range of judges that we have in Canada aren't as diverse as they could be. Probably things need to start like in law school, in police academies, just different understandings of what justice is in different communities. Indigenous communities have different ideas of justice than the Canadian justice system. So impartiality means absorbing a lot of different points of view and making the justice system reflect that. And I'm not sure that's happening right now.
Right. And Promise, you've touched on it. I mean, this is another adage we hear, justice is supposed to be blind, but you touched on the Indigenous population. They're 4.3% of the Canadian population,
Right.
but 25% of the inmate population. So I guess your point would be that justice is not blind.
No, and the issue of impartiality is interesting because judges are supposed to be impartial and supposed to be making decisions based on collecting all the information and taking into consideration systemic and background factors of an individual. But an issue that we have in Canada is the previous government was in power for 8 years, imposed a ton of mandatory minimum sentences. And those are relatively arbitrary, and they take away the ability of the judge, who is a decision maker, to use all the skills and collect all the information without bias and impose a fit sentence. So you have a government that is partial, imposing what their view of sentences should be and requiring by law that judges impose them in situations when it is nowhere near appropriate. That sort of sentence is nowhere near appropriate for the person that's before the judge in particular.
Carissima, what are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely think that we have come out of a period of 10 years of a really aggressive law and order agenda. It's also important to note that any government is going to find it much easier to expand the criminal law than to restrict it. Like, it's always going to be politically more palatable to do that. I did want to just go back to the point about impartiality, that we can look at it in a bunch of, in numerous ways. One is the people that are charged with actually making decisions. The other is the law itself. And it's important that we don't confuse impartiality and neutrality with fairness, because at times the criminal law does take into account the considerations of different people based on their circumstances. For example, there is a sentencing principle that says you should take into account the circumstances of Indigenous people. And if you have too pure an ideal of impartiality, you could attack that, in fact, as being its own kind of discrimination. But that's not how we view impartiality in the legal system.
Sorry, go ahead, Promise.
Yeah, just to make a point about that, that section in the criminal code, it specifically says, it's section 718(2)E, and it specifically says that sentencing judges need to consider the background and systemic factors of all offenders, in particular for Aboriginal offenders. But that section applies to all offenders. It's specifically written that in the statute, and I think that's something a lot of folks forget or aren't aware of.
Denise, I think you've written about this, I know. I mean, is the justice system in this country serving minority groups in this country? How is it viewed by people who seem, by all the statistics, to have more dealings with law enforcement officials in this country, and that's caused a serious controversy in this country? Talk to me about that.
Right, and so I guess the subject of carding, which is being stopped and asked for your personal information, not necessarily in regards to a criminal investigation, that's something that has been a very big issue in Toronto, in very many cities. There have been journalistic projects that show that more often Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are stopped. Jagmeet Singh, who's the new leader of the NDP, has said that he wants to eliminate carding, I believe, which might make it a federal issue, which is interesting because right now, it's municipal or by police force. So I definitely think that racialized communities across the country are more often known to police. And then when you talk about impartiality, so known to police it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't mean you have committed a crime or been charged with a crime. It means the police talked to you once and now your name is on a card somewhere. But that comes into news reports all the time. Oh, so-and-so is known to police. And that sounds very negative, and it really can mean nothing.
Carissima, are you concerned about the way the system is viewed by a lot of Canadians, in particular Canadians in visible minority communities who say they are being unfairly and unduly targeted?
It's a huge problem because we like to say we have the rule of law in this country, which means that we are governed by laws and everyone has to obey the law and everyone is accountable to the law. And yet if some people don't feel that that's actually the case with respect to their interaction with the justice system or police, it creates social decay. I mean, it is an enormous problem in various areas of the country and with respect to particular groups.
Promise, did you have thoughts on that?
Just that it adds to the issue of a lack of trust that folks in marginalized communities and then in broader communities are unable to have. It furthers the issue of distrust of individuals who are targeted by the system toward the system, and that's not doing anybody any favors, and it doesn't help to move forward, and it doesn't help to impose more accountability or respect from the members of the judicial system and the criminal justice system, the police in particular.
Okay, let me look forward if I can a bit, because we've highlighted some of the problems in the system. Let's talk a little bit about where it might be improved. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Beverly McLaughlin, has called for greater access to justice for non-elites and the poor in this country, and for greater efforts to reconcile the historic grievances of Indigenous communities. I think what she's really saying is our justice system is failing the people who need it the most. So, Denise, how do we change that? What's the most important reform you think we could make to go down a different track here?
I mean, I don't know what the most important reform is, because right now we're talking about very high-level justice issues. But if you look back, we often have inquiries and reports, and then no one ever follows the recommendations. And so one example would be police involved, if you would like to call it, mostly Black youth in Toronto. There was a Roy McMurtry report on youth criminal justice in the 90s. That basically none of the recommendations have been followed. And so that group of people tends to interact with police more often in a more often negative way, and we are just always asking the same questions. So I would say, number one, can we follow the recommendations that we already have made and that we already know need to be done? And that's a very, grassroots sort of low-level thing, like how do we make children's lives better so that they don't become involved in the criminal justice system? How can we make sure that police aren't stopping teenagers and carding them so that they're known to police when they commit a very minor crime? And then there are all the things that are higher level that I've already mentioned, which is how do we get a greater diversity of judges on the bench and things like that.
Well, that's important too, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But Carissima, what's the most important reform we could make, or at least when you look at the system and what the system needs, where do you think we start?
I think one point to understand that many people don't is our justice system is particularly unwieldy because you have the federal government, Parliament, making criminal law, but those laws are being enforced by other governments, right? Provincial governments are the ones who actually prosecute offenses. So when you have this fundamental disconnect between who makes the law and who enforces the law, you have the potential for infinite problems in terms of just a lack of coherence. And so I really think that there needs to be much better coordination between those two orders of government. I also think that while the Chief Justice is right to talk about access to justice, we really need to talk about how the criminal code is constructed, how offenses are constructed, really why does it continue to expand as opposed to really to correspond or respond to the social conditions that we face, and what is the best use of this very powerful social tool.
Promise, where does reform to the justice system begin in your view?
I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint one for sure, but to have a healthy democracy, we want to see healthy institutions and a healthy criminal justice system. And one way to do that is to take away a lot, most, if not all, mandatory minimum sentences that are, as you said earlier, hurting the people who need the system the most. Just one example, a lot of folks who are being human trafficked will get charged with importing drugs, and that's a mandatory minimum sentence. So you have often a very young, vulnerable woman who has no control over her own life, who is being charged with importing drugs when she comes over the border, and she goes to jail despite what the judge hears about her life and what evidence is shown to prove that she didn't have that sort of agency. The law stands right now that she will be sentenced to jail.
All right,
so mandatory minimums is a start.
Sorry, go ahead, Denise.
Well, I was also going to say one other area I think is really important. It's sort of two-pronged, which is better funding and support for legal aid, because often, if we're talking about poor people, people who can't take time off work for their appearances, who can't afford a good lawyer, the lawyers who volunteer for legal aid are just overwhelmed with cases, so more support for legal aid. And then also, the Globe just ran a story last week about a former legal aid lawyer out east who's now been taken on by a private firm, which I believe has Pink in the name. And he said one of the best things about this is that now he can deal with the systemic issues underlying why his clients are so often in negative contact with the justice system. So I would say, money for poor and marginalized people who come into contact with the court system is also a good place to start.
All right, let's jump from there. We talked about judge, we talked about the courts. Carissima, how do the courts in this country represent the diversity of this country?
Probably not, but they have made enormous strides. Again, we did have a period where the judicial appointments process was markedly deficient in terms of representing that diversity. I think that we have seen in recent years more attempts to do that. Again, you have different governments appointing judges to different courts,
right.
So it's harder to have coordination. But I think that there are, for example, more women being appointed to courts. I think there are still not very many visible minorities and Indigenous persons being appointed to the bench, and that not really in line with their actual membership in the bars and in the legal profession. So it's improving, but it has a ways to go.
Promise, what are your thoughts on that? Diversity on the courts?
I agree. There's not much. And with respect to Indigenous folks in particular, unless someone's been appointed that I'm unaware of, I believe Justice Laforme is the only appellate judge in Canada who is Aboriginal. And it's disproportionate to the number, to the percentage of individuals who are coming before the courts. We have 25% of the jails made up of what is 4% of the population. So, okay, even though judges there wouldn't necessarily be 4% of the population in law schools, because there's been a misrepresentation, underrepresentation in the past. We need to work on that, yes. But judges should reflect the society that they're serving. And so there's a lot of Indigenous people in courts, and we need to have more judges in courts to be able to identify with them and to understand exactly where they're coming from, to be able to make more fit sentences.
Can I shift the conversation in the little bit of time we have left? There are people who suggest that we need a whole, not just reforms to the justice system, but an entire overhaul of the justice system, that it needs to be less about punishment, less about time in jail, and more about restorative justice, and more about how to move an offender to a better place that isn't a prison. Denise, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is it time to consider a major overhaul of the justice system beyond just changes inside the same system we have, but something more radical?
I think so. I think if the goal, there are multiple goals of punishing someone, and so what it seems to be now is that we want to punish this person. They did what we have decided is a crime, and we want to see them pay. But then they come out, and what do they have in order to live a different life? I definitely think that a more restorative approach that helps them have a better life and their children and their families, therefore sort of stops the cycle that many marginalized people get into. I don't really see what the downside to that would be.
Alternatives, Carissima, are talked about, and I know I've talked to lawyers, it's talked about in the legal community too, but does it have much traction, an idea that there should be a big change to the way we do justice in this country?
Well, it started to happen. In 1996, Parliament actually enacted a wholesale reform in their approach to sentencing in terms of having alternatives to incarceration be expressly considered, to having sentences being served outside of incarceration in the community on conditional sentencing. And the previous government came in and really just completely walked those back because it didn't fit with a particular law and order agenda. So I think that the basics already were there, and the courts were quite on board in terms of really taking that forward. So I think that it can happen. Of course, then you need resources, right? It's as expensive as it is to warehouse people in one place, it's more diffuse to try and meet their needs in the community. So again, and this is not something that Parliament, the federal government, can control. They have to work in concert with the provinces. We
see this particularly promise in the Indigenous community, restorative justice, sentencing circles, a different way of doing justice. Can it be applied on a broader scale in this country?
Yes, and it is. Like, restorative justice works. Restorative justice isn't taking murderers and like going on trips with them and letting them hang out in the community. Restorative justice means restoring the harm in the community. And studies show that restorative justice programs like diversion programs, which apply to everybody, this means if you get charged with an offense, usually it's your first time, you can do something in the community to restore the harm that you've caused, and then the charge gets withdrawn or stayed. So that means the charge gets thrown out and you don't have a criminal record. These programs prove that recidivism rates go down, and that means that people don't reoffend. So these restorative programs that do exist, that cost very little money, show statistically that people do not come back and commit more crimes. A lot of people, there's a healing process that is involved in restorative programs. There's no healing in jail. It's very easy for a lot of folks to just go back into jail and come right back out and continue to commit crimes, but it will actually change their attitude and their self-worth if they engage in restorative programs like diversion programs. And with respect to the cost, Aboriginal Legal Services has a diversion program, and we work with the courts, and they're sort of aware of what goes on, but the specifics of each individual's experience, that's private. But diversion can be, I've been charged with stealing, and it's, you know, I have an alcohol issue, and so I continue to steal from the LCBO. But what real harm is done? The alcohol's recovered, nobody has been harmed. So the individual can then go and meet with an elder, for example, and the elder can help them work through their underlying issue, which is not like a love for stealing, and it's not addiction. Addiction is an issue, but the underlying issue is the trauma that they're trying to cover up by drinking too much, and because they need to get the alcohol, they steal it. Okay. So there are programs that exist, but there are easy, free approaches that community members are happy to help with, and that in cities where the funding doesn't exist, as long as there's a community organization or a community member who's willing to take on an individual who needs help, and I mean Indigenous or not, any type of person could go to an organization that can help them heal. That sort of approach works. Okay. It doesn't work every time, but it does work.
Okay, let's finish this on the remaining time we have in this to conclude our conversation here. Carissima, let me start with you. Are there signs that you point to? Are there reasons to believe that we will be able to say in this country at one point, yes, there's justice for all. It works for everybody?
I'm going to say that I have to believe that in order to go on with the work that I do, but it really requires very focused will and, you know, just political capital, putting your money where your mouth is in terms of policies and priorities. It requires money, it requires coordination in a complex country. Like, it is tough, but we have to do it.
All right, Denise, what's your view? Reason to be hopeful?
Well, Toronto City Council or the Toronto Police Services Board lets every meeting about carding, turn into a mess instead of just addressing the situation head on. So I think that each of these are very micro issues in a bigger macro system, and on the micro level, yeah, sorry, I'm not the one that's here for optimism.
You're not the hopeful one in our group today. All right, Promise, final word to you. Reason for hope?
I am hopeful, and I do want to say I have seen a huge improvement, and I am very hopeful when I go into courts and I see judges taking these systemic and background information and coming up with creative sentences. So I am seeing real change, and it provides me with a lot of optimism and a lot of reason to get out of bed and continue to do this. So I do have hope, but I am a realist, and I'm cautiously optimistic, as they say. But I am hopeful, and I feel like in a couple years we could be maybe having a more positive conversation.
All right. Well, let's make a date to do that, and let's see how much change we get. Thanks to all of you in Toronto today, Denise Balkissoon and Promise Holmes Skinner, and here in Ottawa with me, Carissima Mathen. Thank you all for taking the time to have this conversation. Really do appreciate it, and hope we get to talk again soon. Take care.
Right.
Thank you.